U.S. President Donald Trump arrives in Doha for a state visit on his Middle East tour. President Trump addresses Gaza conflict in Riyadh and voices hope for Palestinian dignity. And the Kremlin says the Russian delegation heads to Istanbul on Thursday for possible Ukraine talks. You're watching Qnews and this is our news bulletin. U.S. President Donald Trump has arrived in Doha for a state visit as part of his Middle East tour. The visit to the Qatari capital comes amid expectations of major investment announcements and controversy surrounding a high-value gift from the Qatari government. Qatar, a key U.S. ally, is expected to unveil plans to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States. Among the anticipated deals is a major order from Qatar Airways for approximately 100 wide-body jets from Boeing, according to a source familiar with the matter. After his visit to Qatar, Trump is scheduled to travel to Abu Dhabi on Thursday to meet with leaders of the United Arab Emirates. While he is expected to return to Washington on Friday, he has suggested he might instead fly to Turkey for a possible meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has called for closer cooperation with the United States to reduce regional tensions as the war in Gaza continues to destabilize the Middle East. His remarks came during the U.S. Gulf Cooperation Council summit in Riyadh today. The summit also saw U.S. President Donald Trump push for more Arab nations to join the Abraham Accords, normalization agreements with Israel. Trump's visit, marked by grand ceremonies and major deals, included a $600 billion Saudi commitment to invest in the U.S. and $142 billion in American arms sales. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced that his administration will lift sanctions on Syria, marking a major shift in American foreign policy following the fall of the Assad regime last December. Speaking at a Saudi investment forum in Riyadh, Trump said the move is aimed at giving Syria a chance at greatness under its new leadership. Trump described Syria as a country that has endured immense suffering, but may now be entering a new chapter. He stated that his administration has already begun the process of re-establishing normal diplomatic relations with Syria for the first time in over 10 years. Trump said he reached the decision after consultations with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
President Erdogan of Turkey, I am also ordering the cessation of sanctions against START. It gives them a chance for greatness. The sanctions were
U.S. President Donald Trump has met with the Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara in Saudi Arabia ahead of a regional summit with Gulf Arab leaders. The meeting follows an unexpected U.S. announcement lifting all sanctions on Syria's government. President Trump indicated that Washington is considering normalizing relations with Damascus, marking a significant shift in U.S. Middle East policy. The talks took place in the presence of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, underscoring regional efforts to stabilize ties with Syria after years of isolation. The United Nations has welcomed President Donald Trump's announcement to lift all U.S. sanctions on Syria. Speaking at a press briefing, UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said the move aligns with the organization's push for sanctions relief to support Syria's reconstruction after over a decade of conflict and underinvestments. Dujarric reiterated support for rebuilding Syria under the framework of Resolution 2254 and emphasized the need for an inclusive Syria where all communities feel safe and represented.
Supportive of the efforts of the interim authorities to rebuild their country in line with the
Syrians have voiced optimism following U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement that he will lift sanctions on Syria, a move expected to ease years of economic isolation and hardship. The decision is seen as a turning point for Syria, potentially reopening access to the global financial system, facilitating foreign investment and allowing humanitarian groups to operate more freely as the country begins reconstruction efforts. U.S. President Donald Trump emphasized that while the sanctions had served a purpose, the time had come for Syria to move forward. And for more in-depth look, we now move to Salman in our newsroom. Salman.
Thank you, Hani. And for further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by the editor-in-chief of Al Akhbar newspaper, Osama El Said. Welcome, sir. And let me first ask you, can you share with us what are the key outcomes of President Trump's meetings with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and the other Gulf Cooperation Council leaders?
Certainly, this meeting is very significant. This GCC summit is the fifth of its kind between its leaders and U.S. Maybe it is the third of its kind with President Trump. There's a clear agenda for the Gulf American cooperation under the following 3 points: security, economy, and the crisis in Gaza. I imagine that both sides are sharing one vision with respect to the security of the Gulf area, particularly within the Gulf concern regarding the Iranian nuclear program developments, in addition to their concern of the waterway security, in addition to the impact of development geopolitically in the Middle East on the energy sector and security. The Gulf countries have the third of the reservoir of the oil and 20% of the gas, along with the sovereign wealth that reached $5 billion that would move us to the economic dimension. Trump has a very aggressive plan with the cooperation economically with the Gulf countries, and there are agreements were signed yesterday, a number of defense and economic agreements of $1 billion that would indicate his vision. The Gaza issue is the most complicated one in light of the crisis and the reluctance of the Israeli coalition in responding to the efforts of the truce. Here, it is very important in light of the dangers of escalation on the Gaza Strip, and the President of America may listen to their visions in the Gulf and the dangers of the continuations of the Israeli escalation on the Middle East that certainly impacts all the parties in the region.
Mr. Osama, what do you think prompted President Trump to meet with the Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara? And how does this meeting impact the U.S.-Syrian relations, do you think?
The meeting between the U.S. President Trump and his counterpart of Syria was a very important meeting and a turning point of the American-Syrian relations. So we should not forget that the U.S. was allocating $10 million in return of giving information about Ahmed al-Shara al-Gilani before takes office in Syria. Yesterday, U.S. announced the lifting of the economic sanctions on Syria, which is a very quantitative shift that might lead to a start of the shift of the international community in dealing with Syria and its new administration. But we should be aware that the issue isn't just related to the sanction for the Syrian government to provide more efforts and work in change its image and change its old one around and very influential figures in the government, and also to take into consideration the Syrian diversity and the issue of sanctions relief to be a start of the integration of Syria in the international community, and we should wait and anticipate the behavior of the new Syrian administration.
Sir, how significant is the decision to lift the U.S. sanctions on Syria, and what are the implications for regional stability and U.S. credibility in the Middle East?
Certainly, Syria is a very important country in the equation of security, regional security, and a collective vision should be established in the region in dealing with Syria and to stop foreign interference with Syria. Syria is very important as it's a strategic way and confessional diversity, and the regional and the international vision to assist Syria to rebuild itself and reconstruct the state and institution. And also, as I said before, the Syrian government should provide many efforts to prove its goodwill, and as it is on one distance before all the factions and the social and ethnic component of the Syrian community. But certainly Syria is a very important country, and the regional conflict might lead to great damages within Syria. Therefore, U.S. should realize that the stance in Syria is a very complicated, tangled, and should work in a clear agenda to put the reconstruction of Syria a priority and give the Syrians their right in building their country, self-determination, their vision that consider all the religious, faction, political components of Syria.
How is Saudi Arabia positioning itself, do you think, as a regional power broker through its coordination with Trump on Syria and its central role in the U.S. GCC summit?
Certainly, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a very important regional player that has influence and ties that enable them to play pivotal roles internationally and in the Middle East. And we've seen a very advanced role played by Riyadh with respect to having resolutions in the crippled situation in the Middle East, or even practicing roles with international roles such in between Syria, Russia and Ukraine. I think Saudi Arabia has the will, ties and potential to play a pivotal role. Most importantly, that such a vision and role be harmonized with a comprehensive Arab framework to consider the Arab regional security and not to look at the Arab countries individually away of the general framework that expresses the interests of the region. And there are very important players such as Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar and Oman. So it is important their vision should be crystallized in the Arab hold, and I think that the upcoming Arab summit will be having a great burden in crystallizing all the collective visions of the Arab countries before the issues in the Middle East that has a great impact and influence on the future of the region.
And from Cairo, that was the editor-in-chief of Al Akhbar newspaper, Osama Said. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on Q News. And now we go back to Henny Saif in our studio.
Selma, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the latest developments in Gaza. U.S. President Donald Trump has addressed the Gaza conflict in Riyadh, expressing hope for a future of safety and dignity for the Palestinian people. He criticized Gaza's leaders for hindering progress with their attacks on innocent people. Trump praised GCC leaders for their constructive efforts to end the conflict and emphasized that all detainees, regardless of nationality, must be released. He expressed confidence that this would happen. During the GCC-US meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has highlighted the importance of strengthening ties between the Gulf states and the US, aiming for even higher levels of cooperation. Addressing the ongoing Gaza war, he expressed a desire to work with the US to end the conflict and find a comprehensive, lasting solution for the Palestinian people. He also mentioned the need for diplomatic solutions to the ongoing crises in Yemen and Sudan. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud called for an end to the Gaza war following the GCC-US summit in Riyadh, emphasizing the urgent need for a ceasefire, release of detainees, and delivery of humanitarian aid. He said all parties agreed on working towards a lasting and comprehensive peace in the region. The minister reaffirmed Saudi Arabia's support for a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. French President Emmanuel Macron has urged the European Union to increase pressure on Israel due to its ongoing blockade of Gaza. Macron urged the EU to reconsider its cooperation with Israel, highlighting that the Netherlands and other countries like Ireland, Spain and Sweden have called for a review of their association agreement due to concerns over the Gaza blockade's compliance with international law. Macron condemned the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's actions in Gaza as shameful, but acknowledged that European pressure may not have much impact on Israeli policy. Macron noted that President Trump holds the real leverage, as Israel's dependence on U.S. support makes it difficult for Europe to influence its actions.
Dès le mois d'octobre, j'appelle à un cessez-le-feu. Dès novembre 2023, nous organisons
At least 20 Palestinians have been killed and 125 others were injured in the Gaza Strip over the last 24 hours as a result of the ongoing Israeli genocide. Medical sources confirmed that the Palestinian death toll from the Israeli onslaught since October 2023 has risen to 52,928 fatalities, with an additional 119,846 individuals sustaining injuries. The majority of the victims are women and children. According to the same sources, the death toll since Israel's resumption of the genocide on March 18th, after a 2-month truce, has also climbed to 2,799, with nearly 7,805 reported wounded. And from Gaza, we move on to the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Kremlin announces that a Russian delegation will travel to Istanbul on Thursday for potential direct peace talks with Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says that the names of the delegation members will be revealed once President Vladimir Putin gives his approval. He confirms that Putin's offer for direct negotiations with Ukraine still stands and adds that Russia will be ready to meet Ukrainian representatives once they arrive. French President Emmanuel Macron has said he supports imposing new sanctions on Russia if it does not agree to a ceasefire, targeting sectors like financial services and energy. Macron said sanctions could include secondary measures on those reselling Russian oil and gas. He confirmed discussions are underway to expand penalties, including potentially freezing more than just the interest on Russian assets held in Europe. Macron's remarks follow similar statements from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz as Western pressure mounts on Moscow in an ongoing conflict.
Les Médecins Sans Frontières, toutes nos ONG avec le centre de crise du Quai. Ce qu'il fait, c'est une honte. C'est une honte. Question de, vous en avez souvent parlé, de centrales nucléaires qui sont très dangereuses pour nous tous. Allez-vous appliquer les sanctions?
The Kremlin has criticized French President Emmanuel Macron's suggestion to potentially deploy France's nuclear-armed warplanes in other European countries, calling it destabilizing. Macron said in a TV interview that France is open to discussing nuclear protection for Europe, promising to outline details soon. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned that spreading nuclear weapons in Europe will not add security, predictability and stability, and called the current state of strategic stability deplorable. Russia previously labeled Macron's push for nuclear leadership in Europe as highly confrontational. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for a face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin during this week's talks in Istanbul, aiming to secure an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Zelensky stressed that only Putin holds the power to enact such a pause in fighting and warned that failure to meet would signal Russia's unwillingness to pursue diplomacy. He also urged the United States and European Union to impose strong sanctions should the talks fall through. These are all the news we have for now, but here's a reminder of today's main stories. U.S. President Donald Trump arrives in Doha for a state visit on his Middle East tour. President Trump addresses the Gaza conflict in Riyadh and voices hope for Palestinian dignity. And the Kremlin says a Russian delegation will head to Istanbul on Thursday for possible Ukraine talks. This concludes our news bulletin for now, but please don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. I'm Hani Saif. Thank you for watching.